Welcome back, everyone. Our next speaker is Danny Franco from the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. Danny has been working with the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy for 13 years, primarily on natural resource conservation, vegetation management, and landscape scale habitat restoration projects. Since 2018, Danny has managed delivery of fine-scale vegetation mapping and landscape database projects in Marin, San Mateo, Santa Clara, and Santa Cruz counties, which included regional collaboration of over 24 local, state, and federal land managing agencies and partners. Danny is currently leading completion of the Marin Regional Forest Health Strategy, a data-driven initiative of the One TAM collaborative that will identify opportunities to improve forest resilience and protect biodiversity, while also strategically managing vegetation to reduce wildfire hazard for communities, key habitats, and other valuable resources. With that, I will now pass it over to Danny.
Thanks, Wade. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'll just get started since time is always precious. So I'm here to share about the new countywide fine scale vegetation map, new in that it came out earlier this year for Santa Clara County, and walk you through 3 example applications. So just a quick kind of outline of what I'll be sharing about today. I'm going to give you a recap on the Santa Clara Countywide Fine Scale Vegetation Map and Landscape Database project. And then I'll walk through 3 example applications to hopefully familiarize you all with the data, and maybe start getting some questions and ideas on how you might be able to use the data in your work. Those applications will be summarizing forest distribution on protected open space lands, exploring canopy mortality by fine scale vegetation map class. And don't worry, I know you all are GIS folks and not vegetation folks, so I'll keep it simple. And then using mean LiDAR derived stand height to identify potential areas of type conversion. Hope to leave plenty of time for questions. So a quick recap on the Santa Clara Countywide Fine Scale Vegetation Map and Landscape Database project. This work was funded by a consortium of local, state, federal, and non-governmental organization partners in Santa Cruz and Santa Clara counties, and led by the Santa Cruz Mountains Stewardship Network. And Santa Clara County was a partner in this project. So thank you to Yoko and Nelly and Sampa and Antonio and the rest of the team for their support throughout that project. This effort aligns with methods used in other regional mapping efforts, including Sonoma, Marin, San Mateo, Alameda, and Contra Costa counties. Some of the key deliverables included a 5-meter fuels model that gives you a model of the fuelscape in Santa Clara County, a wildfire hazard and risk to structures map. This is the example of the hazard map, and then this is the risk to structures map. A 5-class impervious surfaces map. The classes here shown in the legend are other paved surfaces, buildings, dirt gravel roads, other dirt gravel surfaces, and paved roads. LiDAR-derived topography and vegetation structure layers. There's a lot of those. This is just one example of the hillshade. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. An enhanced vegetation lifeform class. So this depicts the landscape into 26 land cover classes, vegetation and land cover classes. So it's a bit more generalized than the fine scale veg map. We also delivered a floristic classification and vegetation descriptions that's focused on describing the classes that are depicted in the fine scale vegetation map, as well as the vegetation communities themselves and the rules governing the labeling of those classes. Fine scale vegetation map was sort of the kind of capstone piece of this project. 121 vegetation and land cover classes with 309,000 features in Santa Clara County based on 2020 aerial imagery. So this map depicts the conditions of the landscape in 2020. All of the deliverables are available publicly to any user that wants to download and access them via the project data portal at pacificvegemap.org. You all might have, for those of you working in Santa Clara County, might have internal access that Yoko could probably point you to, but they're all publicly available, and they're all available also on pacificvegemap.org. Okay, I'm going to jump into applications now. So one great application of the fine scale vegetation map is to be able to summarize the distribution of forests and other vegetation communities across the landscape. I'm going to just focus on forests now, since as I mentioned, there's 110 vegetation and land cover classes in the map. We'll just simplify and look only at forests for a second. Countywide fine scale vegetation map is, again, a detailed depiction of the vegetation communities in Santa Clara County. It's based on local floristic classification, and it's consistent with the Manual of California Vegetation. If you don't know what that is, that's okay. Those are the folks at the California Native Plant Society and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife that are the keepers of the floristic classification for the state. They kind of help enforce standardization. The tool gives land managers and other users great insight into the distribution and composition of key vegetation assemblages, for example, forests and woodlands. So just to toggle back and forth real quickly between these two maps, this is the full countywide fine scale vegetation map for Santa Clara County, and this is just forest and woodland assemblages. So we can use, in this example, I used open space boundaries from the California Protected Areas database, the 2022 update to that database, to summarize the distribution of protected forests and woodlands in Santa Clara County. So these are the protected open space units in Santa Clara County, shaded in gray. And this is the distribution of forest and woodlands in those open space units. This can provide valuable insight into opportunities to improve forest resilience, conservation efforts, protecting watershed health, water quality, water supply, tons of applications in terms of land management and knowing the distribution of different forest types across the landscape within protected areas. So I'm going to show a table next. Don't let your eyes get crossed here. Mostly I wanted to include this as a slide so that people could study it in detail, offline. These slides will be made available, I'm sure, after GIS Day, and you can kind of explore this in greater detail on your own. But I'll just kind of highlight a few examples, and hopefully you can see my cursor of the conifer types. If we look at the coast redwood, I put the common names in here for you GIS folks. If we look at the coast redwood types, there's 11,000 or so acres total in Santa Clara County. Only 3,449 of those coast redwood acres fall on protected open space lands. That's interesting. So roughly 31% of coast redwood in Santa Clara County is protected, right? And so you can look similarly across, other vegetation types like blue oak. If I move down to the deciduous hardwood species, blue oak are deciduous, right? They lose their leaves at around this time of year. And there's 83,000 acres of deciduous blue oak in Santa Clara County, with 23,000 acres falling on protected open space lands, or 29%. So you get the idea. This is a great way to understand, if you're a conservation planner looking into land acquisition, protecting habitat for specific species or specific tree types. And this is really valuable information to understand, how much of each of these vegetation, forest and woodland types, fall on protected open space lands. We could drill down a little bit into a little bit further detail. Again, not intending to make your eyes go cross-eyed here, but really just to illustrate. Across the top of this slide, I have the sort of the largest land managing agencies in Santa Clara County. That's state parks, county parks, Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District, the Open Space Authority, and the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, or SFPUC. And this just gives you an idea of who's managing how much of what forest type, right? So again, won't go through the whole thing, but just looking quickly at the conifer types, again, at the coast redwood that we looked at previously, you can see that Santa Clara County Parks actually manages 78% of the protected coast redwoods in Santa Clara County. This might be news to Santa Clara County Parks. They might not know that they have, more than 3/4 of all protected coast redwood fall on county parks lands in Santa Clara County. This is an example application of the fine scale data, and why it's so valuable is to give managers kind of an understanding at the regional or at the county-wide scale, how much of a particular resource do they actually manage and are responsible for. Similarly, if we look at the deciduous hardwoods again, last time we looked at the blue oak, we see here that 56% of the blue oak actually fall on California state parks lands. So that's good for state parks managers to know, although you have significant portions on county parks and on SFPUC lands as well. So this is just a great example of how we can look at the distribution of forest and woodland types across jurisdictions to help inform land management decisions. Okay, I'm going to jump into another example. This one is exploring canopy mortality by fine scale vegetation map class. So with support from the Santa Clara County Fire Safe Council, percent canopy mortality attribution was developed for all forest and woodland classes within the Santa Cruz Mountains ecoregion. So this attribute in the fine scale vegetation map for Santa Clara County covers just this kind of western portion, the Santa Cruz Mountains portion. So the values will be null, on the other side of the 101 freeway for forest and woodland types. This attribute in the fine scale vegetation map, the attribute itself is called percent standing dead 2020, based on 2020 imagery and LiDAR analysis. What it does is it estimates the percent of woody canopy mortality, defined as, canopy is defined as vegetation above taller than 7 feet from the LiDAR. That did not show live crown in the 2020 imagery. And I have an example image here, and what I'm going to do is just, you can see kind of outlined in blue, and I'll toggle back and forth between these, this kind of view from above forests. But you can see that there's just pockets here. Here's a good example, if you keep your eye on this spot here, of, what looks to be, not green tree crown. And indeed, that gets picked up here. And then they get turned into, an area feature and then calculated for each fine scale vegetation map polygon. There is some human kind of adjustments in removing false positives. There's limited manual editing for that attribute. Canopy mortality attribution is really useful for understanding the distribution of mortality in forested stands that could be related to forest stressors, right? Forest and woodland stressors, things like drought, pests, pathogens, things like sudden oak death, which you may have heard of in your work. So this is just a map showing you sort of, what I did was I binned up the canopy mortality. They're in the fine scale vegetation map, they're attributed at kind of the integer scale. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and all the way. But I just looked at the distribution of these values for Santa Clara County and just binned this up in ArcPro to give you kind of a classified canopy mortality. This helps managers kind of hone in on, and I'll show you in the next slide, identifying areas with canopy mortality to support landscape scale forest health and fuels reduction project planning, right? And I did a lot of this work in Marin County using this particular metric and other forest metrics, to get at this question of where do we have opportunities to do multiple benefit work, project work like forest restoration and fuels reduction. And canopy mortality is a really useful attribute for kind of carving up the landscape and identifying those potential project areas. This is just a zoom in. I believe this is Sierra Azul open space, and you can see some of the areas with higher pockets of canopy mortality. This is probably related to sudden oak death in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and then pockets where you don't have as much mortality. Important to know for users and keepers of the GIS data is that this canopy mortality is not diagnostic as to the cause of, so we don't know, because it's a remote sensed metric, we don't know what's causing the dieback in tree crown. It could be temporary in the case of a sort of a pest outbreak in which the tree subsequently recovers. It's a snapshot in time based on that 2020 aerial imagery, and you also don't know what the actual species is affected, right? So you can infer like some things based on the fine scale vegetation map class. For example, if this were a coast redwood stand, we would assume that it might not be coast redwood. It might be some co-dominant or subdominant species that assembles with coast redwood, most likely tan oak, which is really susceptible to sudden oak death. But this data doesn't tell us what the species of the affected tree is, right? Just kind of points to a problem, potential problem in the forest canopy. And I won't go through all of this, but again, this is a great way to kind of summarize the data for land managers. So drilling down into this application is just looking quickly at the distribution of percent canopy mortality classified in these bins that I created for each forest and woodland type in Santa Clara County, and looking at the total number of acres within each mortality class. So you can sort of quickly look at, okay, well, we have lots of California Bay in Santa Clara County. That's this class here. A couple 2,000 or maybe less, maybe 1,800 acres of it has high canopy mortality. We can express that data in another way, right? So this is the percentage of total acres in the county. For each forest and woodland class, you can see that all the ponderosa pine, all the Monterey pine mapped in Santa Clara County has mortality in this greater than 6% of the canopy class. That's probably important for land managers. I mentioned tan oak. That's this class here. A lot, high amount of the tan oak acres, a large percentage, can say greater than 50% of the tan oak in Santa Clara County is classified as having greater than 6% canopy mortality. Right. So this is, again, really useful information for land managers, forest managers, watershed managers, lots of folks. Okay, the third and final example, I think I'm doing really good on time, is using mean LiDAR derived stand height to identify potential areas of type conversion. I mentioned previously the work that I led in Marin County with the OneTAM collaborative to develop LiDAR-derived structural classifications for various forest types to inform a regional forest health assessment and strategic plan. And this is basically using the LiDAR-derived mean stand height data that's embedded in each fine-scale vegetation map polygon. So I'll walk you through a little bit of this. This is kind of be background for you GIS folks on how land managers kind of think about forest structure and how it's useful. So research shows that the exclusion of fire, including modern fire suppression, and the interruption of indigenous burning following colonization, facilitates type conversion in fire adapted landscapes, meaning one vegetation type that's dependent on fire as a form of disturbance for regeneration might disappear from the landscape with the exclusion of fire from that fire adapted landscape. So conversion of grasslands, shrublands, and open canopy oak woodlands to Douglas fir forests is prevalent in the Bay Area, including Santa Clara County. So I'll walk you through this kind of cool study that was done in Marin County using aerial imagery from 1951. This is, if you're familiar with the area Bolinas Ridge in Marin County. This is Bolinas Lagoon down here. And what this researcher did was to compare the 1952 imagery to the 2020 or 2018 imagery in Marin County. That's the image on the top right. And to use our fine scale vegetation map to classify the areas that had filled in, classify what they had filled in as, and to calculate that percent change. This is a really great paper that Charlie Starton did. And, she provides metrics in terms of both the number of acres of type conversion and by actual class. But what she found is that it's predominantly Douglas fir that these grasslands, these larger grasslands that you see in the 1950s aerial imagery, are now converted to Douglas fir. And what we did in our analysis was then look at, okay, what is the height of those Douglas fir stands, the mean LiDAR-derived stand height, which is an attribute in the fine-scale vegetation map. What is the height of those stands that have, since the 1950s, filled in those grassland areas? And what we found is that almost uniformly across the county, that those areas of successional change or type conversion correspond to Douglas fir stands with a mean LiDAR-derived stand height of 60 feet or less. So that enabled us to look at the distribution of Douglas fir stands in the veg map with a mean LiDAR drive stand height attribute of less than or equals 60 feet, and identify areas of this potential type conversion phenomenon. I just did a quick query for Santa Clara County, and I've highlighted these stands. The Douglas fir is the kind of lighter green stands. Again, looking at, this is the portion of Santa Clara County where Douglas fir really is a co-dominant. And so the lighter or the darker green is knobcone pine. I checked in with some managers at Mid-Penn prior to my presentation and putting this together, and they said that in some cases knobcone pine can also kind of act like Doug fir and do type conversion in the absence of fire. And indeed, this is an example of some work that's happening on Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District lands, where they are actually managing Douglas fir encroachment. This is in Bear Creek Redwoods, and we can what managers at Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District shared with me is that indeed they have an 11-acre project ongoing right now to address Douglas fir encroachment, and this corresponds with an area that I flagged in the Santa Clara Countywide fine scale vegetation map as having Douglas fir with a mean LiDAR drive stand height of 60 feet or less. So just another like really clear application of this great data. I want to acknowledge, again, I already mentioned Yoko and team. Santa Clara County Technology Services and Solutions Department was a big partner and supporter of this work. So thank you so much, Yoko and team. Lots of other people, too many to name individually. If you're interested in this work, you're obviously going to have access to these slides, but you're also welcome to reach out to me. I'm available to all of you if you have questions about this data or about this presentation. And with that, I'll stop for questions.
Great, thank you, Danny. It does look like we've got 2 questions for you. So the first one, these are extremely detailed data sets. What was the biggest challenge to complete this project?
Yeah, since this is a project that kind of follows the methodology developed starting in 2013 in Sonoma, and then applied in Marin County in 2018 through 2020, at San Mateo County around the same time. The technological methods used have been sort of refined over that decade period of time. And so the technology piece and the methodology and development of the data products was relatively straightforward. Again, we relied a lot on some of the state standards for this data. Obviously, there's federal standards for LiDAR. There's great federal standards for imagery, and lots of good practice. When it comes to the actual mapping of these products, there's a lot of existing state standards and best practices that we leveraged, both to make sure this data is consistent with other regional data sets, but also just to enforce consistency wherever possible. So from the technical side, Wade, and to whoever asked the question, I guess it's Yoko. The biggest challenge is really related to kind of managing the huge team, right? That was needed to deliver this project. I'll say that each of these names on this, or that I showed previously on the acknowledgement slide, had some hand in this project. So coordinating 24 federal, state, and local agencies, managing field staff who are collecting calibration and training data, having a project that's funded by a consortium of 15 different funders, so just tracking the budget alone for a almost $4 million project with 15 different funders and a team of maybe 20 different agencies and consultants. Having a hand in the deliverables was probably the biggest challenge, but since that was my job, maybe that's why I feel like it was the most challenging. We could ask the mappers what the toughest part is, but from my perspective, just the coordination piece was the toughest.
Sure, thank you. So another question, it looks like someone volunteered for the National Park Service through a restoration group, and the rangers mentioned that they collected data of the plants that they planted and the seeds that were collected in that area. Is And their question is this data added to the database that the GIS team would use?
Oh, interesting. Here, let me read that question for myself
Yeah,
so I understand.
yeah, no problem. Yeah, it's a little longer.
Well, thank you first of all for volunteering for the National Park Service. Wildland Restoration Warriors sounds awesome. Um, collected data on, of course, plants planted, seeds collected. Um, so this vegetation database. So the short answer is no, right? That the data that the National Park Service would be collecting on restoration work. So, for example, plants planted, seeds collected, maybe weeds removed. That data is kind of at the site specific scale, and the data that we developed here about vegetation communities is really at the landscape scale. We did two counties concurrently with this data, and so it's really intended to depict vegetation and land cover conditions at sort of a scale that's applicable to sites, but it's really applicable once you start zooming out from the site specific scale to maybe a watershed scale or a sub-watershed scale, or even a land managing agency scale, or even a county scale. That's where this data becomes really, really effective. We did collect some initial data from folks like the National Park Service and others as ancillary data on sites where they manage vegetation and have information about the land cover in those sites. But that was really just kind of to inform our training and calibration data. And when it was used as reference data a little bit when creating the map, but it's certainly not added to this database. This database doesn't really operate at that scale. I hope that's clear, but if it's not, I'm happy to kind of answer in another way.
I think that I think that answers the question, and well, at least from my understanding from it. Another question for you is understanding this is public domain data. Do you have stats or info on who uses these data sets?
Yeah, that's a really great question from Yoko. And we don't have stats or data right now, but we do have the ability to, well, I should say, let me say it in a couple ways. We don't have stats right now on the web traffic from pacificvegemap.org, but of course we have the ability to pull web traffic data, and it's something that I would be really interested in exploring further. That wasn't a part of the project as we scoped it, but I think it is a really useful metric for understanding kind of the return on investment for Santa Clara County and other project partners, as well as just insight into who might be using this data that we all invested so much time and energy into. The Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network did do a preliminary survey last year before the fine scale vegetation map came out to understand who the users were currently of the data products that were available at that time. Because as you'll remember, Yoko, there were lots of kind of rolling deliverables as part of this project, lots of interim and intermittent deliverables that were foundational to subsequent map products. So we did do a survey, and I will make a note to myself to share the survey results with Yoko, with you and your team from that initial survey. But it might be nice to kind of follow up on that, and you could kind of connect with Dylan from the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network if you're interested in partnering on that effort. Got time maybe for one or two more questions?
Yeah, we're good on time. We've got 3 minutes left, so it looks like we have one more question. Will you have an application to map crops, such as corn, grapes, etc.?
So some of the land cover maps, I'm sorry, some of the land cover classes in the fine scale vegetation map are related to ag. It's not crop specific. It's a little bit more generalized than that. The kind of parameters that were used is if it's kind of irrigated or not irrigated land. That's really easy to see in the imagery and ancillary data. Orchards are certainly called out separately from managed hay fields and things like that. So I encourage you to check out the fine scale vegetation map. You can go to pacificvegemap.org and read the data sheet, which actually has a kind of quick breakdown of some of the different classes that were mapped. So there is some representation of agricultural land use in that area, but it's not quite as fine scale as crop type.
For sure. Great. It looks like we have another question, so this will be our last question. How do you cope with year-to-year or longer-term change? will you recollect these data sets in the future?
Yeah, that's a really great question. One that we could spend a lot of time talking about. I think what we'll say is that I think, from my perspective, the value of these data sets really increases with time. Change detection is one of the principal applications of this data, especially in the event of landscape scale disturbance, things like climate change, things like wildfires, right? As those events happen inevitably in the future, and the impacts on the landscape and vegetation communities unfold, this baseline that we've established through this fine scale vegetation map becomes a really, really important foundational data set for understanding and quantifying and locating areas of change on the landscape. In San Mateo County, the RCD has put forward and was funded a proposal to the CAL FIRE Fire Prevention Grants Program to do, actually, I think the CAL FIRE Research Grants Program, to actually do some automated change detection techniques. So using Landsat and Sentinel imagery, which has high temporal resolution, as well as other data in the public domain, to really identify areas of change on the landscape, so that future updates for this data, when there are those inevitable changes, can be done leveraging automated techniques to the greatest extent possible, to both, increase the frequency of update, the ease of update, and of course decrease the cost of updating this data, so that we can learn from changes that happen in the future.
Great. Thank you. So, well, I think that's the end of our time right now, but thank you so much, Danny. Your presentation was very informative and really cool to see. And obviously, I think by these questions, a lot of interest in this. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And for everyone else on the call, we'll now take a quick 5-minute break, and we'll return back here at 11:20. So I'll see you then.